Okay, you're all set.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the December 9th, 2020 meeting of Hanson's Community Preservation Committee. Along with myself, Tom Hickey, we're joined tonight by a quorum of our committee, Eric Olson, Phil Clemens, Patty Norton, Karen Duclos, Teresa Santalucia, and we may be joined by a couple other members, and Shirley will make note of that as they join. I only have a brief update in terms of the agenda. We won't be voting on Part B of the Winter Street application, which we got into a discussion on last month, but Phil will provide an update, and we're likely to see that as an item for voting at our next month's meeting. And later in the agenda, you'll notice we're very, very fortunate to be joined by the Community Preservation Coalition's Executive Director, Stuart Saginaw, who will provide us some context and background on what's involved with Community Preservation Act funds and bonding. So I look forward to some information in that regard. I'll start by asking for a motion to approve the minutes of our November meeting. Do I have a motion?
I do move that.
Motion by Patty and
I would second that.
second by Phil. Any discussion on the November meeting minutes? Okay, hearing none, I'll just call the roll. Patty,
Yes.
Phil,
Yes.
Eric,
Yes.
Aaron,
Yes.
Teresa,
I'll abstain. I wasn't at the meeting.
very good. John, hello, John.
Hi, I missed something.
We are voting on the November meeting minutes. Would you care to weigh in on a vote yay on those minutes, or?
I would go for a yes. I've read them. They
Okay,
seem accurate.
thank you. And I'll also vote yes. So that's 6 yes, no opposed, and 1 abstention. Thank you very much. Okay, great. And so now at this point in the agenda, I will turn it over to Stuart, and just a little more context from our last meeting. As a committee, there's a very good chance in the future that we may find ourselves talking to town entities about projects that would involve CPA funds, the work of this committee, and the potential that what we may want to do as a town with future CPA funds may require us to consider bonding future revenues. We know that there's a partial application for design fees for the Hanson Middle School field that is likely to be on our agenda going into the winter and into the spring. And we know that there are other projects in town that are being talked about that could be CPA eligible, including some of the ideas at Plymouth County Hospital site, of course, and the McQuan property. So Stuart, whenever I am fortunate in the last several years to say, and that whenever we have a question, we can always reach out to Stuart for some direction. It's a pleasure to welcome him here to our remote meeting. Oh, Stuart, I'll turn it over to you. He's going to present through Zoom on a screen and offer us some insights on CPA and bonding, and answer any questions that committee members may have. Thank you, Stuart.
All right. So let me just start the show. All right. How are people seeing that?
Fine.
Looks good.
Yes, it's clear. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, good. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to your meeting. This is a popular question about bonding. And so we prepared this presentation a while back and keep it updated, because very often we get asked by a community, usually the first time they bond, what's involved with bonding with CPA. And before I go on, I'll mention to folks, when you share a screen, often Zoom puts all the photos of yourselves over on the right-hand side. And if that's going to block your text, you can grab it at the top and move it if you want to the top of the screen or the bottom of the screen, or you can minimize it. You have a lot of options of what to do with all the pretty faces you're seeing of the rest of the committee. All right, so back to the slide. So CPA really is set up very well for communities to bond. And in fact, almost 100 communities have done that. It's really popular. We have 100 communities, but you'll see that almost 300 projects have been bonded. So many communities have bonded more than once for a project. And there's over $417 million in outstanding bonds, which is a huge amount of money that folks have committed to community preservation in their communities. Normally, the things that people bond sort of fall into a few main categories. By far, purchasing land is the most popular, whether it be land for open space and recreation, like you're seeing in these pictures, land for constructing affordable housing, land for athletic fields. That's usually the most popular thing that folks would issue a bond for. Doing a top to bottom rehabilitation of a historic building. So if you have town hall that needs rehabilitation and you want to do it all at once to make it most efficient, obviously it's going to be more money than you have, and that's a popular thing to bond for as well. And then lately, a lot of communities, since we did some amendments to the law in 2012, have used CPA funds to build complete recreational complexes. Hanover has a massive recreational complex where they purchased the land with CPA funds and then built it out with, I think, 4 baseball fields and soccer fields and playgrounds and parking and all that. Very big project and only made possible because of bonding under CPA. So when you do borrow with CPA, it is a general obligation bond of the town. So the town is obligated to pay it back. And if the CPA fund, is not around to do that, the town would be on the hook for the money. But that would never happen because there are safeguards in place to make sure that CPA is what pays it back. But the bond wouldn't be able to be issued unless the full faith and credit of the town was behind that bond. When you're trying to figure out how much you can bond for, the bond council will not let you bond against the state match money. That's an uneven funding source. And although we just had a really terrific match, we don't know about the future in the state match. So your local surcharge is very steady and it goes up every year, just a little bit. So that's what you can bond against, the amount of money that you collect locally from your surcharge. And one thing to note is that when you go to town meeting, if the CPC chooses to bond a project, and it is up to you when you make your recommendation, hopefully you're doing this already with all your projects. When you recommend a project, you obviously have to recommend the amount of spending for the project, but you should also recommend the funding source too.
Yes,
Whether you're taking it from the housing reserve account or the undesignated fund balance or from next year's revenue or bonding. That's another funding source that you can choose under CPA, and you would make that recommendation. But when it got to town meeting, it ratchets up the level you need for a vote from majority to 2/3. Now, a lot of times that doesn't matter. If you're buying land, in almost all cases, town council is going to require a 2/3 vote on that anyways. But it is something to be aware of, that 2/3 sometimes can be very hard. And I've seen so many projects fall into that dead zone between they get the majority vote, but they lose by 2/3. So that's something to be aware of when you recommend bonding as your funding source. You want to determine how much money you can bond against your local surcharge. And it's always a good idea to just go ahead and do that, even right now, even though you don't have a particular project in mind that you might want to bond. You start every meeting with a good idea of how much money you have in the bank. You probably have a spreadsheet. Someone, has a idea of how much is in the historic reserve, how much is in the fund balance. So you know what's in your accounts that you can spend. But why not know what you could possibly bond? What is your capacity to bond under your local surcharge revenue? And, there's a bonding capacity spreadsheet that your municipal officials, probably your town treasurer or your financial director or business manager, every town calls it something different, could prepare this for you based on current interest rates and show you what your capacity is to bond. And then it's a good idea to, have them redo that every year so that when you're looking at projects, you know that you have this money potentially available through a different vehicle than just spending the money you have. So this is a bonding capacity spreadsheet we did in my town many years ago to show us what we could bond for, and then what the payments would be for future years against that bond. And 525,000, that figure in the first column, that was our local surcharge that year. And you can see it projects to go up every year. When you bond for, let's say, open space, which is what we were considering this time, you can't bond all of that local surcharge, all of that 525,000, because you have to leave 10% for historic and 10% for community housing and possibly 5% for administrative if you're going to be doing that. So you don't have the full local surcharge available to you when you bond because you have obligations for the other categories. And you can follow this down. Basically, what they determined down in yellow was that at a 20-year bond, which was the maximum back then, current interest rate back then was 4.5%. The town could have afforded a $1.79 million bond on our CPA revenue. And the debt service in yellow, that's what it would look like. It would be about 135,000 a year. So I'm happy to send this spreadsheet. Tom, if you follow up with me after with a quick email, it's in Excel format, so you could actually give this to your town officials and they could just blow out the numbers. And the formulas are in here, and that would make it much easier for them to do that for you. And then you just have an idea as you move forward throughout your project deliberations of what your bond capacity might be. So I'm happy to send that along. When you do have a particular project in mind, you really want to ask the town for a debt service schedule. You want to see what the principal and interest is going to be on a bond. And, they can only do it based on the interest rates at the time. They might change by the time you go out to bond 6 months later or that sort of thing. But it just gives you an idea of what the hit is going to be on your local CPA budget every year to have a debt service schedule. And your town treasurer can do that for sure. You'd be surprised at how low the interest rates are on municipal bonds. I mean, obviously interest rates are incredibly low right now. Even for us to get a home equity loan or buy a house, interest rates are incredibly low. Municipal interest rates are always even lower than that. So I don't happen to know what they are now, but it wouldn't surprise me if the municipal interest rates now were 1.5%, something incredibly low. So it's not a bad time to think about bonding against CPA. We won't have these incredibly low interest rates forever. And it might be a long time until we get them back. So, obviously much better to bond when interest rates are in the onesie twosies percents rather than the 9 or 10%. And they have been there in the past and probably will be at some point in the future. So how long can you bond for? The state provides guidelines to municipalities on bonding, and it's done by the type of bond you're going to issue. So if you're issuing a bond to buy a police car, the schedule at the state says you can only bond for 10 years because, a police car, you can't bond a police car for 20 years. It won't last 20 years. But most of the things that CPA would bond for can go up to 30 years. The maximum used to be 20. And about 5-6 years ago, the state raised the maximum for a lot of different types of purchases to 30 years. Construction is usually 30 years. Buying land is 30 years. If you rehabilitated town hall, it'd probably be 30 years. That doesn't mean you have to go 30 years. And that's what that, debt service schedule, you'd ask for it, ask the town to show you 10, 20, and 30 years, just to give you an idea. Because obviously, just like your mortgage, the longer you go, the more you'll end up paying an interest over time. But the smaller amount of money will come out of your annual budget and you'll have more money to spend on other CPA projects. If you are going to go ahead and recommend a bond and you are voting on it at your meeting, you want to include in your vote the bond term. So someone would want to say, I move that we bond $1 million for 15 years to buy the Johnson property or to build the athletic complex on Peacock Street. You want to put that term right in your vote. And you'll have seen all the paperwork from your town and all the debt service schedules, and you'll have decided as a group what makes the most sense. But we had one community once that did not do that. And then it wasn't mentioned in the warrant article either. And if that happens, then the town treasurer has the right to determine the length of the bond. And the CPC was expecting it would be a 20-year bond, the longest that was available at the time. And the town treasurer decided, no, I'm going to bond it for 10 years. And so the CPC had a lot less money for other projects in those 10 years than they thought they were going to have, because they thought they were going to pay it back over 20 years. So we always remind people, include that term in your recommendation and make sure it's in the warrant article too. And that way the treasurer will know they have to issue that bond for that amount of time. You'll obviously work with your town officials to write the warrant article, but to pay back a bond with CPA funds, the warrant article does have to specify under authority of Chapter 44B. Chapter 44B is CPA, and you'd want that right in the warrant article. There are costs to issue a bond, and they're pretty hefty. I think when we bought a $3 million piece of open space land many years ago, I think the bond costs were around $50,000. So it's not an insignificant amount of money for all the legal costs, the closing costs, the issuance costs on the bond. It has to be rated by a rating agency. So you have to pay them to examine the finances of the town and put a rating on that bond. So there are definitely some costs, and CPA can pay those extra costs. So if you need $1 million to do your project, you'd want to get an estimate of what the closing costs and bonding costs are going to be. They're called issuance costs from the town. And you would be asking town meeting in your recommendation for $1,050,000, let's say, $1,050,000 rather. If they told you we need $50,000 in closing expenses and issuance costs, you would ask the town for $1 million in acquisition expense to buy the land and $50,000 in miscellaneous related costs. As I mentioned, you want to put the bond term in the warrant article as well. There's no reason you can't do a project with a variety of funding sources. So, and this is very common, you're buying $1 million piece of land and you have $500,000 in your fund balance that you could spend or your open space reserve. So you'll recommend to town meeting that they buy this land for $1 million. But use $500,000 from the open space reserve and bond $500,000. So you can mix and match money you have already in the bank. You don't have to bond the entire project. And unlike most bonds issued by the town, there is no ballot election required. You've already had your ballot election. You have CPA adopted in Hanson. I think you have 3%. Do you have a 3% surcharge?
1.5.
1.5. Okay.
1.5.
Great. So you have a 1.5% surcharge. So the taxpayers have already given you authority, to have a 1.5% surcharge revenue every year, and you're just bonding against that future 1.5%. So you've already had approval at the voting booth for the money you're spending. They adopt CPA with a 1.5% surcharge. You're just spending from the future surcharge as opposed to this year's surcharge. If the town was to, take out a bond to build a new school for $30 million after town meeting voted on it, it would have to go to the ballot, and both would have to vote yes. But with CPA, town meeting is the end. After the bond is issued, the town might want to combine the CPA bond with something else. So, for example, when we bought that piece of land at our spring town meeting, and town meeting gave the approval to issue that bond, we knew that the town was going to have a special town meeting in the fall to build a new police station for $15 million. And so the town waited to actually issue that bond until after fall town meeting. And then they went out to the bond market with an $18 million bond, $3 million for CPA and $15 million for the police station. And the law actually encourages you to do that, to marry different projects into one bond. You're sharing the issuance costs and keeping those down, and you potentially could get a better interest rate because it's a larger bond. So if you did that, you would just, they would calculate a percentage of that bond that belongs to CPA. Let's say 15% of that bond is CPA and 85% is the police station. Every year when the debt service came due, the town would just charge 15% to the CPA budget and the rest to the police station budget. You do every year have to include the annual debt service in your budget that you present to town meeting. So if you know you've bought a piece of land and now you're paying $110,000 a year for the next 10 years on that land, you got to put that in your budget. You have to know that, you know, you don't have your full local surcharge to spend this year. You have $110,000 less. And the town would give you a debt service schedule and you make sure to include that money in your budget. And then the town would have the money to make the annual debt service payment. Town meeting can decide not to take the money in a particular year from the debt service, from the CPA budget rather. That has never happened, but it is possible. The town meeting could say, no, you keep your money, we'll take it from free cash for this year. But it does not work in reverse. You can't use CPA funds to pay back a debt service on a bond that was authorized under another funding source. So if that bond didn't say under authority of Chapter 44B in it when it was issued and passed by the town, you can't use CPA money to pay it back, even if the bond was for something that is CPA eligible. So we had a situation where a town bought a piece of open space before they had CPA. Then they passed CPA and they were in year 7 of the bond payment. And the finance committee thought they'd get cute. And they said, hey, this is a piece of open space. We could save ourselves some money on the town budget and let's ask CPA to pay that debt service this year. You can't do that. That bond was not issued under CPA, so you can't use CPA to pay it back. Typically you guys, know that you have every year you have to spend or reserve 10% of your annual revenue in each of the 3 categories: housing, historic preservation, and open space and recreation, which share a reserve account. And if the way you do that is to immediately reserve that money right off the top at the beginning of the year, you wouldn't have to do that in the category for which you issued a bond, because your bond payment counts against that 10% spending. So if you are required to put $100,000 next year in each of those 3 reserve accounts, and you have that bond debt service payment for $110,000 for buying a piece of open space, you don't have to put another $100,000 in the open space reserve. Remember, the rule is spend or reserve 10% each year. So you wouldn't be reserving that money because you already spent it on the debt service for the bonds that year. So how does that work? How do we illustrate that, the way that works? Well, let's say your town, I know you have a lot more revenue than 100,000, but let's say you had $100,000 in total revenue for your budget for the year. That would mean you're required to put 10,000 in each of the 3 reserve accounts, 10,000 in historic and 10,000 at housing. But you had also bought a piece of open space and your annual debt service is $15,000 on that parcel that you purchased. So therefore, when you're doing your budget, you don't have to put another 10%, another 10,000 in the open space reserve. You've satisfied that. And then you'd have the rest of your budget filling out to get that 100,000. So it counts against that year's spending. So potentially, if you did a 20-year bond to buy a piece of land and the debt service every year was more than 10%, you wouldn't have to put anything in your open space reserve for 20 years because the debt service every single year would cover. Now, this comes up the first time a community thinks about bonding. Comes up every single time. If you do recommend bonding, this will come up either at the finance committee meeting before town meeting or at the selectmen's meeting, or someone will stand up on the floor of town meeting and someone's going to ask, you're asking us to do a 20-year bond under CPA. What happens if we revoke CPA? As you know, after you've had the program for 5 years, and it's been more than 5 years in Hanson, the citizens could revoke CPA. It has never happened, by the way. We have 186 communities now in the CPA program, and not one is ever revoked. But it does not take away your ability to revoke. If you issue a bond, the town can still vote to revoke CPA, but you still have to pay back the bond. So you could do that probably one of 3 ways. As soon as you were revoked, as soon as the town voted to revoke CPA, they would grab all the money in your account and freeze it. And that would all be put toward the future debt service. They wouldn't let you do other projects. You could keep your CPA surcharge on the tax bills. Actually, instead of 3%, you guys would do 1.5%. So if you still have 7 more years to bond, to pay off that bond, the tax bills were still going to come with a 1.5% CPA surcharge until you had accrued enough money to pay off the bond. Then the CPA surcharge would drop off the tax rolls. So if you're putting everything of that 1.5% toward the future bond payments, it wouldn't take you 7 years to accumulate enough money. It'd probably take you another 2 or 3 years, and then the tax surcharge would drop off the tax bills, and the town would have enough money to pay that bond debt service every year. And then DOR also says that you can reduce your CPA surcharge at the time of revocation to whatever is needed to fund the annual debt service. So if you need a 0.37% local surcharge to bring in enough money to cover that annual debt service, you could reduce your surcharge to 0.37% for the rest of the bond, and then that would drop off the tax bill. This is a little bit theoretical because, as I mentioned, no one has ever voted to revoke CPA. So we've never had anyone that had an outstanding bond vote to revoke CPA. But it's a question that will come up. I guarantee it. And it's just important to let folks know that you don't need to, it does not take away your right to revoke CPA if you do issue a bond, even if there's 30 years. You're going to have to pay back that bond, but the town could still revoke CPA. And then when the bond was finally paid off, the tax bills would reflect no CPA surcharge. So those are sort of the basics. As I mentioned, it's a short presentation, but it's good information to have as you think about it. And a good next step, I think, would be, even if you're not, don't have something specific now, is to get that bond capacity spreadsheet and just know, what you have the ability to do in case something comes in the pike or you're doing some planning. It's always good to know when you're doing planning of future projects that you potentially could have this funding source. So Tom, I'm happy to answer questions, or if you need to move on your agenda, that's fine too. But either way, we could do questions now, or folks could email, or however you want to handle it.
Thanks, Stuart. I'd be happy to, if any members of the committee had a question, I want to thank you for your time, and I'll definitely email you regarding that spreadsheet, and we'll compile some numbers for the committee to just have as a reference going forward. That's very helpful. I may not be able to see everybody on the screen right now, but any committee members have any questions for Stuart?
No.
Oh, okay.
All right,
Great.
Tom, I can also send you a copy of the presentation as well, so you have that.
Thank you. That would be helpful, Stuart. I'll email you later tonight, and whenever you have a chance, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll reply with both those documents. And if questions come up afterwards, you know where to get us. If you ever need my email address or our technical assistance hotline, our website, www.communitypreservation.org, is a great resource, and my email address and phone number is on there. So, well, great being with you.
Thank you, Stuart.
All right, have a good meeting.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, thanks very much for listening to that, and we'll be sure to get you copies of those documents that Stuart mentioned. I'll move on to the old business part of the agenda. The first item, review of the Hanson Middle School fields. There's no update. I've been in some communication with the folks that had submitted Part A, and we'll see whether or not this is something that can be revisited and conversation continue with perhaps our next meeting. Item 5B is the Part B application from Conservation regarding Winter Street. Not taking any action on that tonight, but I'll recognize Phil, provide us with an update from our last meeting.
Yes, the reason we don't have the Part B application in front of us tonight is because, well, the preparation of that is competing with many other things, but something which I think the committee can take as good news is the Board of Selectmen directed Town Council to speak to the owner and potential seller of this property about the information they'd provided to the town, the notice of the purchase and sale agreement, and the legal term is Town Council found that the information provided to the town so far was deficient, including such that it was missing some things like phone numbers and potential and intended future use of the land, et cetera. And that means that the 90-day clock that the town has to consider its right of first refusal has not even started yet. So the time urgency has been reduced. I wouldn't say it's been done away with because it's not, but the seller and town council are all in communication. And at some point soon, I anticipate the 90-day clock will start. So what I would anticipate, Tom and others, is going back and getting the Part B application done, and done right, not rushed, but done right, probably to be ready for our January meeting. And we'll see where we stand now with regard to the seller's information and anything else.
Great, Phil. Thanks for the update. And Shirley, we'll keep this we'll keep this under old business for our next meeting and continue the conversation. And if we do have a completed application, we will send it out to members with several days notice. Thank you, Phil. Item 5C, we'll just go into the updates on existing projects since the last time we met. Diane, anything on North End Cabins?
Hi. Okay.
I should say welcome, Diane. I didn't have a chance to greet you at the beginning.
Okay. It's been a really busy day. No, nothing. No.
Okay. No worries. We'll get another crack at it next month. No worries. Next item, in Alan's absence, we'll pass over the updates on Bonnie House. Phil, Thomas Mill conservation restriction.
Well, as our minutes from the last meeting reflected, we had learned from the Wildlands Trust that the town needs to provide the more detailed meets and bounds description of the property, and that the project funds that we still have will allow us to get that prepared. We have not yet gotten that prepared, so that's in process, but at least we know what to do, and that's the way forward to get this thing eventually completely off our to-do list.
Great, thank you. And also, Phil, Botieri Field, should that, I don't recall off the top of my head, we're going to keep that on for monthly updates, or were we close to wrapping that up?
Well, I would like to turn it over to Eric because the sign which was in place produced for the ball field side of things, I don't know if they're going to need to spend any money on posts or whatever, but the sign has been placed into Highway and Parks and Field hands, so maybe they would have an update. I don't know.
Thanks.
I know the sign was delivered. I don't know if it was installed. I'll have to check on that and get back to you on that.
Very good.
All right, Eric, thanks. We'll keep it on the agenda, and if we know before our next meeting, we tend to take a vote in order to kind of close out a project, and then we turn any remaining funds to the account from which it was authorized. So we can tidy that up once we know that if Eric says that it's all buttoned up, we'll take that next step. Thank you. Phil, the PCH Park Engineering Plan, any updates on that?
I might have had an update, except that the 5 p.m. meeting that committee was having today, I couldn't go to because I was at another meeting because of the water department's oncoming well project. So I don't have an update. That's a long way of saying no update yet.
Okay. We're a little under a month since our last meeting, so there may not be a lot of movement on this this time of year as well. Sleeper Preserve is the next item.
As indicated in the last set of minutes, the town council and the council for the owners, they're still working on resolving the title questions. And until that question is resolved, nothing else can really happen. So we pretty much weekly try to stay in touch and see if there's any new developments on that. So we're going to have to know, I would say within the next few months, what it is, but I see no reason why they wouldn't have resolved things again within the next few months, and keep you posted.
Okay, great. And the trail grant as well, Phil?
I've not had a chance to update that the Part B with the corrected figures so that they match what town meeting authorized for dollar amounts and everything. But as you say, it's been a fairly short time, but also filled with holidays and some strange other delays. So I don't have an update on that, but I look forward to 2021, including not only an update on the paperwork, but on the actual project itself for that trail.
Very good. Thanks, Phil. Okay, for committee members, the next item is new business. Is there any new business? Okay, great. The only other item is to adjourn, but I'll just interject here for ease of planning and scheduling purposes. If we schedule a meeting in January and we follow our normal monthly schedule, if I could just indulge me for just a moment, that would put us at second Wednesday of January, which would be January 13th. I assume that's far enough after the holiday and New Year's window that we could continue with that schedule for January 13th. Again, you don't have to know, your entire schedule, but no major objections at this point.
Nope.
No, that sounds fine.
Okay.
I'll have to double check and see when our conservation meetings are, because we have switched this past second half of this year. We've switched to meeting on Wednesday nights, but I'll check and see which Wednesdays they are, and I will advise.
All right, Phil, in that case, because conservation would be talking about that Part B application, we can stay in touch. And if we have to adjust the time maybe slightly on that evening, I'll go back to the committee and we'll see what we can work out.
Right. Conservation meetings start at 7. So again, if there's a meeting that night, schedule-wise, I'd have to do something different, but we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Okay, Phil, thanks. Okay, very good. So with that, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion by Patty, second by Diane. Without any discussion, we'll call the roll here. Teresa?
Yes.
Don?
Yes.
Karen?
Yes.
Diane?
Yes.
Patty?
Yes.
Phil?
Yes.
Eric?
Yes.
And I think I'm the last one. Yes. All right, 7:40, we stand adjourned.
Merry Christmas, everybody.
Happy
Merry
holidays.
Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Happy New
All
Year.
right.
Thank you. Good